You're listening to Schools Sisters, episode number 72. Welcome to Schools Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Schools Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me at Afterthoughts. That's where you'll find my thoughts on educational philosophy and homeschooling, as well as my Charlotte Mason study guides and workshops. My co-host today is Mystie Winkler. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Our guest on the show this time is Kevin Clark. Kevin is the founder of the Ecclesial Schools Initiative, an organization that's partnering with local churches to plant a network of affordable and accessible Christian classical schools. Kevin is an Alcuin Fellow with the Society for Classical Learning and a member of the teaching faculty in the Master of Arts in Classical Teaching program at the Templeton Honors College. Most importantly, he is Taryn's husband and father to Aubrey, Caedmon, Naomi, and Eleanor. It's not too late to sign up for spring training. If you are listening to this episode right when it comes out, the first session was Monday, and there are still 2 sessions coming up. Session 1 was so good and gave us so much to think and talk about. Head on over to schoolsisters.com/springtraining to register. In today's episode, Mystie and I have a rousing conversation with Kevin Clark about the trivium and grammar sections of the revised edition of the liberal arts tradition. What changes were made to the book for this new edition and why? You will really enjoy hearing his answers. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our School A every day. So, Mystie, you want to head us up on this one?
Yeah. I feel like my reading lately has just been follow Brandy. I started 2 books this month. Paul Johnson's The Modern World.
Oh, good choice.
So where are you at, Brandy, in that book? Because you're reading it with your oldest, right?
Yeah, we're in the last 3rd, maybe even the last 4th. But I mean, we started it in August, so right. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I'm in the, it's 1922.
It stays that way for a long time, actually.
Yeah. It's an audio, so it's already been 2 hours, but in 1922.
The longest year.
Yeah. It's just so fascinating, and I love Paul Johnson. Mm-hmm. So I've already read History of the American People, and I enjoy it on audio, but I need to get a paper copy because he has just some great quotes that I can't get on audio.
It really does.
But just about people being he is not afraid to share his opinion about how stupid some ideas are.
That's true.
And so it's like the only audiobook that I've listened to in a long time where I have to listen to it at 1 speed. Like I can't speed it up because it's just so good. And the language is really, he is a crafter of words.
That's true.
And there's a lot of information there. So I've been really, really enjoying that. And then I'm also reading None Greater.
Yay!
Matthew, what is it? Matthew
Barrett.
Barrett, yes.
Yeah.
So that was a book purchase made after a School A Every Day last season. So,
Kevin, we have a saying, it's not an episode until someone buys a book. So, sometimes we even race to Amazon for used copies of books and see who gets the cheapest one first. The sickness. I'm glad you're reading None Greater. It is my favorite theological book in such a long time. It's so good.
It is. It's been really great.
None Greater.
Write it down. You could make this an episode.
It's about the attributes of God.
Yes.
I've not heard of it.
I really loved his book because he really drives home this idea that God is his attributes. And so we can interpret any listed attribute through the idea that he is infinite. So thinking about his love or his goodness or whatever, through the lens of infinity is different than thinking about just goodness on its own. I was telling Misty before that I had read some sort of study on the attributes of God when I was early college, like probably freshman or sophomore. And I did not come away feeling more worshipful or anything like that. And I think it was because it was just very analytical. Like it sort of felt like I took God and diagrammed him like a sentence. And so this book had the exact opposite effect. And I think it was what I expected when I was in college trying to kind of sort out my theology proper. And so this book has just been amazing because it drives you to realize, how small you are and how large God is. It was just so good.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just took over your Scholé every day, Misty, but
you said it better than I could have. I'm not very far in. I'm just on barely started the second chapter. So
yeah, it gets better, even better. So anyway, Kevin, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah. I've I love hearing when people, they talk about reading two books. I just start books all the time and they kind of, are ongoing and running. Right now I'm reading again, Till We Have Faces, C.S. Lewis's best book in my mind. And I know it's hard to choose there. Reading that one again, and then also reading The Great Lent by Alexander Schmemann, that's kind of a deep dive of a book, but it's part of a reading group over the last month or so that's been reading that. And that one is, it's also a book on theology, but it's if you've ever read anything by Schmemann, his real famous work is For the Life of the World. And he looks at what we can understand and know about God by looking through the practices of Christian worship. And, some of it's like this, coming at things in a little bit of a different way. He's an Eastern Orthodox theologian. And so that's not the tradition that I'm part of. So there's some things that it's like, oh, what is this new, different way of thinking and worshiping? But there are profound resonances with, like my own Christian experience. And then just thinking about, as you just said really well about Matthew Barrett's book, it sounds like that it's a kind of theology that issues in doxology, right? It leads you to praise and to adore God, which all theology ought to do. That's Christian theology. Schmemann kind of turns it the other way around and says, let's look through praise and worship of God to see how we understand ourselves in relationship to him and how we understand the scriptures and what the great teachers of the church have said. So it's a challenging book because it's about Lent, it's about fasting and praying and seeking God that way through discipline. It's also kind of going along with Till We Have Faces in some really interesting ways as well.
Oh, neat.
Yeah.
I love it when books talk to each other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's the best, isn't it?
It sure is. Okay. Say the name of it again. I want to make sure I remember this.
Oh, yeah. The Great Lent.
The Great Lent.
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't heard of this author before. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, Alexander Schmemann. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correct. I call him Schmemann, but I've heard people say it a little bit differently. You'll find him if you do that Google search. I guarantee you'll. But For the Life of the World is his big work, and that might be a great place to start with him.
On this show, you're allowed to make up how to pronounce someone's name, and as long as you're consistent,
we go with
condemn you.
Yeah, sin boldly, right?
Well, I guess I shall go next, and I'm still, I've had a hard time reading, guys, through this quarantine.
Oh, yeah.
Because I keep reading the news, which I don't know why, because at the end of the day, I'm still stuck in my house and not allowed to leave. But somehow it feels like I'm doing something if I read the news and know how things have not changed since last time I checked. So Abby, what did Abby tell us a couple weeks ago? She said, if it's news, it's not Scholé.
Yep.
But I'm still reading the news. So obviously I'm having trouble.
And it's preventing your Scholé.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's been so good for me that I have pre-reading that I have to do for my high school senior, because that means that I'm forced into reading mode, and I'm forced into reading mode long enough that I actually get into it. And it's refreshing. I need to make myself do it more often. And I just have had a really hard time the last couple of weeks. I read this thing that said that, the news does help sometimes. I read this thing that said Amazon was going to stop mailing books as a priority because they weren't essential, which I beg to differ. But I had this momentary panic. And so I bought panic books. And then it was funny because they came on time. Like they both came yesterday, and I just was so happy. New books. This morning, I started looking at one. and it was The Well-Educated Mind by Susan Weiss Bauer. I love her subtitle, A Guide to the Classical Education You Never Had, because, of course, that's the situation so many of us find ourselves in. We didn't receive something that we're trying to give to others, which gets complicated sometimes. So I'm looking forward to it. And she actually, can I say this, Misty?
Yay!
Okay, yeah. She agreed to be on the show next season. So we're going to talk to her about her book and her plan in the book for moms and others who don't actually have graduate degrees in these things. Anyway.
Oh, that's great.
So far, I love it because the idea is you don't have to choose between all being like graduate school and nothing being remaining just as we are. So far,
it's a great reference book.
I was noticing that.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't committing to as much as I feared I was committing to.
Yeah.
In the beginning.
But the front matter has stuff on how to run a book club, like how to have a conversation with someone else about books and like different paths to read, because she breaks, literature down into a few different, there's poetry and history, literature. And she kind of gives a few different options for ways that you can tackle the lists. I think it's a great book.
It looks like it's going to be. I mean, I've only read like 2 pages because I did that whole, I got a book, so now I need to read a little bit of it. So I've only read 2 pages, but I was pretty excited. And I kind of felt like, I think if I start a fresh book, I can help myself get into reading instead of trying to return to things that I'm struggling with right now. So I'm hoping it'll pull me out of my quarantine funk.
That's so important though, Brandy, that you bring that up. I think people don't realize the way that being plugged into the stream really does squelch that desire to read and to learn. And it makes you unquiet, like in your heart and your mind. You just can't focus on the words. I've experienced some of the same things over the last few weeks. And that's probably where a lot of our students are sometimes in schools.
True.
That we live in a culture that constantly has them turning over and upset. And you can't listen. You can't be still.
My 2 younger children take an online Latin class. And I was just talking with their teacher today because she was saying, trying to balance the whole like continuing, not as if nothing is happening, but because routine is good for them versus acknowledging that they're all kind of out of sorts and struggling with all of this too. Even though they're accustomed to online classes, because this has always been an online class, their whole lives have been turned upside down in so many ways that, trying to find that balance in the classroom with them, she's having issues, small ones, but issues coming up with students that have never been there before. And she's pretty sure that it's just that life is different now. And they're dealing with it too. So, well, if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and transition to our topical discussion. We wanted to talk with you about, the grammar session, but I actually wanted to start a little bit with the introduction to your liberal arts section. So we know that you wrote the liberal arts tradition, co-wrote it with Ravi Jain.
Yes.
And I mean, the difference between the old and new editions is remarkable. For example, in this introduction to the trivium section, I was comparing the 2 books a couple days ago, and I was noticing that, it's not that you changed anything in that introduction, but it's what was formerly 2 or 3 paragraphs is now 2 or 3 pages, or maybe even more than that.
Yeah.
When you said in, I don't know, one of the ad campaigns that you guys added 40% more, that was for real. Which I'm loving. As you know, I loved the first edition of the book, but what's been really nice is to compare the 2 and to realize that you guys didn't add any fluff. Like everything that I see that you've added is really adding in the truest sense of the word. It's fleshing out this area in a way that it wasn't fleshed out before. So we were just wondering, before we get into any specifics, what was happening in your life that caused you guys to bring this back out and make all these changes? And can you tell us about the process and how this all happened?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for, sometimes you revise something that's really important to yourself and you put it out there and maybe, nobody really pays attention to it. So the fact that you appreciate it, that means a lot. Thank you so much.
Sure.
A number of things happened. It's this book, the original edition of the book was part of a conversation that Robbie and I have had for years. And it turned into at first like some white papers where we're just trying to get some ideas down. And then it turned into a book length form. And so in one sense, from when it got published, I guess that was in 2009, maybe, just over the course of 4 or 5 years, the conversation went on, and we were understanding more fully some things that we had latched onto and thought that we kind of understood really well, that, well, they just took on more depth, being in conversation with each other. So some of that's reflected there. There were things too where, I guess I could say this, when I wrote the original trivium section for the first book, so much has been said about the trivium. And I think people feel like they have such a strong handle on it that almost to say anything about it seems bold or arrogant. And so I was a little bit, Robbie gave me a hard time. He said that I pulled my punches. I didn't tell people what I really thought. and so some of it was just deciding to say a lot of the things I really wanted to say about the trivium in particular. But then there was a bigger context. Between 2009 and 2014, we made contacts with the underground church in China that has had a burgeoning classical school movement kind of at the church level. And somehow, I don't know the whole ins and outs of it, but they got in a hold of the manuscript of liberal arts tradition, and we're working on translating it. In the course of that, we got connected with the folks there and ended up going actually to China and working with kind of a hub of the underground church and doing a teacher training event that represented 60 or 70 different schools kind of across China. And I think it was, which was just wild and amazing and humbling to be among Christian brothers and sisters in that context with all the unique challenges they have there. And just to see how excited, you think about yourself as a Christian, the struggles that we face in our lives here in America, but to think that you're in a context that's adverse to your Christian faith, and you think the most important thing you need to do is set up an underground illegal school to give kids a solid Christian education. And so we wanted to give them something that was actually going to be useful and meaningful, but not take for granted all of the cultural things we share in America. And that got us thinking, wow, there's a lot of stuff that we assume that we didn't say in liberal arts tradition. We need to provide some more context. And like you said, we need to flesh some things out so it's clear and maybe tangible, some of the things that some of the ideas we're trying to express. And so it was actually that experience of having to teach people in a different context where we couldn't just assume they knew everything that we take for granted. It caused us to reflect on what we had already written and think that more needed to be said.
Okay, so I'm putting some of this together. Is that why some of the history lessons here that you couldn't assume? I mean, because they're not in the Western tradition, so you couldn't assume like a basic knowledge of the Western tradition and how it was handed down. I noticed you added a lot of history.
Yeah, exactly. So in the moral philosophy section has a lot more history in it, and even the grammar section too. Yes, we realized we couldn't take for granted some of that transmission, but then we thought, we can't really take that for granted in an American context either.
Yeah,
it's important just to provide a lot of that to make the whole book more intelligible. And like so much of my experience as a teacher, that in having to teach, I become better at understanding the text or the ideas myself, and it ends up becoming a more enriching experience for me. And we tried to reflect some of that enrichment that we got in this larger expanded edition.
I loved in the new edition just how much the sources are cited and showing this is a tradition. So in talking about an idea, you mention ancient writers and the medieval thinkers, and kind of all through, and it you're not making this up. And this is a tradition that has this long history. And I find myself underlining in the footnotes as much as in the regular text. So, and thank you for making them footnotes and not endnotes.
You're welcome. We are firm believers in footnotes. Right. I don't want to get too philosophical about them, but I actually am philosophical about the footnotes. It's a way to keep a person, right? It's like inviting people to a conversation that, here's some people that I've been reading and thinking about, and I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, and you're able to see them at the same time. And so it really is. I know that some people give us a hard time about how many footnotes there are, but it was really important to us to have them in there because, part of the logic of this book is that there is this great kind of open secret that's called the great liberal arts tradition. And we as teachers have grown just by simply diving back into it. And we're giving you kind of the initial findings in our life. And hey, you just jump back in too. If you read, I don't know, Ernst Curtius's, I just happened to look down at his work, you're going to find the same kind of things I found and maybe more. If you read Aristotle's Politics, I mean, oh my goodness, you could spend your whole life studying that. And so we really wanted to bring people into almost the same pages where we kind of had our nose in books and invite them to look along with us.
That's a good reminder too, I think, for us as homeschool moms, that immersing ourselves in the tradition. I mean, this is how you grow as a classical teacher, and it's how we can grow too.
Right.
I think sometimes moms can overthink it. Like, you teachers out there have some sort of magical thing that's happening. and we don't realize that there's just human ways to grow.
Right.
And
Right.
the big one being reading and tapping into the tradition. I love that.
Yeah, I love it too. Can I say yes and to that? When you were talking about Susan Weisbauer's book, I thought the same thing there as well, that in teaching, I think because we live in a culture of like expertise, we think that what you have to bring as a teacher is expertise in a given area of subject matter. But the entire classical tradition is like a habit of heart and mind. It's a way of being part to your students. And so the most important thing you can do as a teacher, whether you're teaching your children at home around the table or whether you're in a classroom, is to be engaged in the kind of life you want to pass on. So sitting, reading books and having a book club with your friends is actually serious professional development for being able to teach a literature class, because you're doing the thing you want to pass on. I'm a firm believer in that as well.
Okay, can we ask you a controversial question?
Yeah, why not?
I thought it's only fair to warn you before I ask. Okay, so I have to ask because it feels like you did a 180 on something.
Okay.
But Mio, maybe you said that Ravi thought you pulled your punches, so maybe it wasn't as much of a 180 internally as it was externally. But okay, so in the first edition, you say, this is page 38 for people who like footnotes. You say, Dorothy Sayers' application of grammar as a metaphor for learning the rudiments of the disciplines is true and should not be overlooked. I did cut a little bit in the middle of that sentence. But in the revised edition, on pages 49 to 50, you say, the grammar of grammar has never meant to learn the rudiments of all the subjects. Rather, it means, and then you list out these things that it means. And I threw a party on Facebook when I read this. Like, I made a quote graphic. I threw a funeral for the grammar stage. I mean, the whole thing. And but I don't know if that was actually fair to you.
Brandy might have a little bit of a problem.
I may have a problem with the grammar stage, with the idea of a grammar stage.
Yes.
Which I do secretly call a philosophical travesty, which is no longer a secret because I just recorded myself saying that. But I think,
and I'm laughing in agreement with you. Both here.
So I got to ask you, so like, what was that, a total 180, or was it, I want to give you room to not be misinterpreted by, like
people with an agenda,
people like me who have problems.
Well, no, it wasn't a 180.
Okay.
But what it was is, let's see. So I have to find the language here, the grammar of grammar. I mean, strictly speaking, the grammar of grammar has never meant the grammar stage. No one ever used the phrase grammar of grammar before. And, I think, well, I love Dorothy Sayers. I just have to say that, of happy memory. Anytime my favorite translation of Dante is the Sayers translation. Again, that's a Minority Report answer. I love it.
Huh.
I love it to read it out loud, just to hear the sound of the language. It's kind of like I get to have Milton and Dante at the same time. I love it.
I don't have that one.
Oh, you have to get it. Even if you don't want to read her translations, I understand why some people don't like it, because she tried to pull off terza rima, like the interlocking rhymes, in English the way that Dante does in Italian. Yeah, I know. It's exciting because she wanted the English reader to feel the way English would speak to you, the way an Italian reader would have Italian speak to them. And so even like there's some funny stuff that happens, in the Italian text of Dante where people from different regions of Italy will speak to one another. They recognize each other by dialects. She does that with different dialects, whether it's like, Scots or Cornwallish or something like that. She'll try to. Yeah, she gets really deep into it. So it's awesome. But her footnotes are like the most brilliant interpretations of Dante ever. So anyway, there you go. Plug for the Penguin Classics edition of Dorothy Sayers. But, if you read the Lost Tools of Learning, like if you think about there are some things to be gained from her approach to the metaphor. And I think thinking about the trivium as a metaphor. And I think in the first edition, it was an issue of pulling punches that I know that the classical education renewal or movement was sparked by well-intending people who took those ideas and turned them into like stages of learning. Like it took a very modern developmental approach to learning and, put Dorothy Sayers' language into it. I know that some of that comes from there. I mean, but there is an insight to what she does with the way the arts are connected to each other. Yeah. So it wasn't as much of a 180 as it was for me to really want to say the thing that motivated me maybe more often than anything is like, get rid of the idea of grammar stage. Stop.
Yeah.
Grammar's an art. It's not a stage. It's not a development of learning. I'm going to continually get better at grammar for your entire life. You're not going to progress from one stage to another. And some of that stuff that you call grammar is actually the musical education. It isn't just a creative way to teach grammar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry. I hope that would have been a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that was great. I mean, and I feel like that kind of dovetail with one of the objections I've always had was that using that terminology kept us from fully understanding grammar. And so it felt to me like not helpful because, you would see things like, I mean, I noticed that you put history and literature and everything back into grammar. And I felt like all of that had kind of dropped out the second that grammar became some sort of stage that children were supposed to travel through. And I felt that was unfortunate.
Right.
to say the least. So,
well, and then it's funny when you actually study the formal study of grammar in the logic stage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what people usually mean by studying grammar is actually a lot more dialectic than it is grammar. It's analysis. It's almost like logical systems that they're trying to figure out. Like, that wouldn't have been the grammar that, say, I don't know, Virgil would have studied or that Augustine would have studied. He'd have been memorizing a lot of, Augustine would have been memorizing a lot of Virgil. So memory is far more important than poetry and history and even geography, I guess. Yeah.
Good point.
Yep.
So is it using the word grammar that ends up being the confusing point because it can, the word grammar then takes on this different meaning than we used to, like it's the formal analytical study of a language is what we mean by it now, not what it is in the sense of the trivium. And so we kind of import that modern meaning.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's what's happened to a lot of key terms, right? Whether it's terms like art and science, we talk about that too. The curious history of the term science and how it's come to mean something that's very different from any of the way people have used it in the tradition. So there's these words that are kind of like key terms in the whole tradition, and they've taken on, starkly different meanings now. And then we read back into the tradition with the meaning of those terms, and we completely misunderstand what people are saying.
So true.
Yeah. It's fascinating though to think that that's happened a lot. But you think the art of grammar would actually help us with that, right? If we had read a lot of books and poured over literature, the meanings of even the term grammar, we would say, that's kind of interesting. When they talk about grammar in this text, it doesn't sound like the analysis of language as a system.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Lewis's book, in some ways, The Discarded Image, I think, one of my favorite kind of scholarly books from Lewis, it's basically a book of grammar. He was concerned that his incoming students to Oxford couldn't read anything written before Milton because their imagination of what like the world looked like and what terms meant was either misguided or just ignorant, to be frank. And so he wrote this book in order to kind of redirect people's their minds, open their ears and their eyes to be able to see and to hear things in text that they're missing because they hadn't had a grammar education.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love how in the section it's about being immersed in language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And filling the storehouse. I just think those are great images and metaphors to think about. I think that focuses it on what we can do and what it does mean and what it does look like.
Right. A former colleague, a mentor of mine, Dale King, the late Dale King, he introduced me to that metaphor, and it's really worked on me probably over the last 15 years, this idea of this well-stocked storeroom of what's been well said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's only one way really to get that. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur calls it the long detour. You have to take the long detour through the literary tradition you have to just pour over readings, and eventually not only the ideas, but the cadence of language will fill your mind and your heart and give you an ear for what sounds right and what's well said before you know the rules and reason why.
That reminds me, I did have a Charlotte Mason moment here. just because there's a couple places where she talks about, we all have this museum inside of ourselves. It's in this city of man soul that she imagines. Well, she imagines it most vividly in ourselves, which is her 4th volume. But she talks about how the lessons that we're learning in our school lessons or whatever they're stocking this museum with its artifacts that then we'll be able to draw on for our whole lives. And so, when the child's doing their artist study, they're actually hanging that painting on the wall of their mental museum, it's there is sort of a connection, I think, to this mind palace thing that the Middle Ages kind of had. But I think it's not quite as formal as what they were doing. But I remember thinking about places where she talks about, as they're reading history, it's sort of like they're putting up these sculptures of these great heroes, in that museum. And so anyway, when you were talking about, stocking up the storeroom or everything, I thought, it's Charlotte Mason's museum, I think.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. I agree totally. And the more I read Charlotte Mason, the more, I interpret her totally, whether it's fair or not. The musical education. She's totally building out a pedagogy of musical education, what we call the intellectual part of the liberal arts. That's that kind of formative, receptive. She's training ears and eyes and developing an imagination. And I think she's really powerful pedagogue if you want to know how to do this part, the absolutely foundational part to liberal arts education. I think Charlotte Mason is the place to go.
As people make this mental shift to understanding the fullness of grammar, how does that look in practice? What does this look like for curricula or for schools? Are you seeing people make changes as they're following the ideas from your book?
Yeah. I've seen some. In some ways, the kind of grammar school education is the place where everyone cut their teeth in classical education. I think there's a lot bound up with keeping it the same and not changing. So in some ways there is resistance to change. I don't know that it's active. It's more well, this is the way we've done it. And, if we're not only diagramming sentences and only memorizing, lists of prepositions for grammar, what are we going to do? And do we have time to start with Mother Goose rhymes? Honestly, I love John Senior talks about that. You want to get the cadence of spoken English, well-spoken English into a child's heart. Mother Goose. Start there. Memorize those, say them all the time. It'll train their ear.
For sure.
Yeah, and you think about that, or, I love the Charlotte Mason's insight into reading, Shakespeare every year, right? Who cares if they can understand it or analyze it? This is one of the sources of our language together. So I have seen teachers starting to be more kind of letting go of the idea that everyone has to be able to understand and articulate back what it means as an interpretation, instead of just saying, oral reading in a very clear, articulated voice to children is training their ear as an essential tool of grammar. Fairy tales, traditional stories, absolutely essential, might be more important than learning how to diagram a sentence right now. And I've used diagram twice. I'm not speaking against diagramming sentences. I think it's great. So I don't want to be misinterpreted.
Oh, that's good, because Misty has a thing about diagramming sentences.
Love sentence diagramming.
But she gets really stressed out.
Only with teenagers.
Good point.
It's beautiful. It's like the beautiful math equation, right? The well-diagrammed sentence is a thing of beauty. But and then, I have seen people moving away from that, but they do feel like they're letting go. And I think this is where Charlotte Mason is really helpful, to where I think a bad option, if you've kind of been in this really heavily analytical memorizing, in the excursus in the back of the book about reading for memory and imagination, where I draw the distinction between memory and memorizing. When they're moving away from that, I think the error is to then just kind of not have any serious plan. Just have fun and read, and not really expect people to commit things to heart. And I think where people are turning is they're turning to the pedagogies of narration from Charlotte Mason. Okay, if you have to build the intellectual aspect of the art first, if you have to train a student's ear for what's properly said, then we need the narration's an answer to the question on how you do that in a systematic way. That's still it's serious, it's hard work, but it's definitely respecting the musical education basis of grammar.
You actually do sort of talk about the diagramming of sentences, but you say how important it is to have intuition about language and about how if you don't have this foundation, then you're not going to have the intuition. And it reminded me actually when I was reading this of something where Mystie had talked about teaching students that just knew the rules, but wouldn't you say, Mystie, that basically they didn't have the intuition?
Yes. It's like they had memorized the lists and they knew the words and they could parse a sentence that fit the patterns they'd been taught, but they couldn't play with it. Like if you brought in just a sentence from some other context, they couldn't think about it. They could follow the pattern, but they couldn't just play with it and they weren't interested.
Yeah.
So to try to pull them out and to get them to think about it, like, well, I don't care if we're getting this 100% correct. We're asking questions and thinking about how the words are working in this sentence. And that's why we learn those words and why we learn these patterns is so that we can take a sentence from the wild and figure it out and talk about it.
Oh, that's great. A sentence from the wild. I love that. But what's interesting, that exposes like a deep commitment to modern education that's kind of in all of our bones. This idea that you start with theory and you go to practice, and it's a matter of application. And we always scratch our heads like, how come kids can't apply their knowledge? And you go, because anything you actually know how to do effectively in your life, you did not learn in a theory to practice model, period. It always starts with the kind of poetic experience with somebody who knows more, who guides you through practice and gives you kind of like continual feedback practically. And then you kind of get theory as your poetic experience increases. You think about a child learning how to play violin in the orchestra. They grow, both of those things grow together. And I can't remember if I put it in the book. This is so bad now. I think I didn't. Do you know it's one of Plato's dialogues that's not really taught on a lot, but it's called the Lysis.
I haven't read that.
It's kind of funny because it's Socrates has a conversation about the nature of friendship and true love with two 12-year-old boys.
That sounds fun or horrifying. I'm not sure which.
So of course it's going to be an enlightening conversation because they have so much to offer. Right. And I think, the Greek audience, the original audience got the irony, like, of course this conversation is going to go nowhere. And it gets kind of cast out in the modern era because it's also, it gets considered like it's not an authentic Plato's dialogue because, it's kind of contradictory and everything like that. But the meaning of it, I think, really is that he talks to these two boys and they give him like chapter and verse Plato's doctrine of love. I mean, it's the best. And Socrates mercilessly refutes them the whole time. And I think the point is that they're giving answers that their experience cannot connect to. And there's this idea, the Doric harmony of logos and ergon, the harmony between your words and your deeds in life. And they have all word and no deed. And so they don't really understand what they mean, and they're never going to be able to apply that knowledge in real friendship and real love. And it could also be kind of dangerous to only have theories without any, poetic experience. I think that with liberal arts, education, this idea of, to bring it back to grammar, where a person whose ear is trained by the scriptures, by poetry, great literature, starting with Mother Goose, going through a child's garden of verses, all the way to Milton or something like that, or Shakespeare, they're going to have this feel for what's said well and said right. And then you turn the analysis of language, loose on in that part of education, and it's going to solidify and really galvanize what's been learned poetically into a very powerful tool, not just one that's going to cut things down, but one that's going to be productive, I think, in their education. And that's the whole vision of liberal arts education. It's like the most radical challenge to modern education we could find is this undermining theory to praxis, saying no, poetic experience, then theory will make people who can practice well.
On page 54.
Okay.
You write that the first goal of grammar education is to cultivate a student's memory through imitation. And I think we've been getting at that.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, so like, let's say, I mean, my kids are big now, but let's say I have a little guy and he's entering first grade this year. I mean, talk to that mom. What does it look like to reach for that first goal? I know you've said Mother Goose,
Yeah.
but really, like, what does it look like for me to cultivate his memory through imitation? Can you give me some more examples? I get that from Mother Goose, he's going to get things like rhythm and cadence and a concept of rhyme, and it's going to be fun too.
All important, by the way. Every single one of those is essential. Yeah.
But what else? Like, what else how am I actually cultivating his memory through imitation? That feels so big to me.
Yeah, I know it does. It sounds like all kind of big and awkward there. Yeah, cultivating through imitation. I mean, at the most basic level, when you read your child every night, read them good books. And, you think that, reading to them in a clear and expressive way, think of Quintilian's Institutes of the Rhetorician or the Rhetor. He says, if you want to make someone who's going to be a world-class rhetorician, the first thing you need to do is choose the nurse very well, right? Make sure that she speaks, speaks the language, completely, clearly and articulately, because those first inclinations toward language are formed there. So I would say, learning nursery rhyme songs, I think, honestly, the great tradition of hymns in the church are an astounding means. I was talking to my 9th grade daughter about it. She's a musician and loves just sitting at the piano with the hymnal and just kind of like learning sight reading on the piano just by going kind of page to page. And we were looking at just some of the forms of expression of some of the hymns and think like, wow, these are rich. They're really well done. And so you imagine someone who's used to singing hymns. I'm thinking some of the great prayers that have been authored in the church. So thinking like you could have this day that when you start your day in prayer or devotion, including, you don't have to always, read only the most intelligible translation of the Bible. I mean, read the King James every now and then, memorize verses from it, incorporate hymns, traditional prayers. And so then it kind of like works its way, again, another Charlotte Mason insight, right, into the atmosphere of education. When you reading to children can't be, overestimated in how important it really is. I think we make that distinction between people who are read to and people who are reading, instead of thinking that attending to the word being read. I was thinking about Mystie listening to Paul Johnson on his recordings. I was thinking I listened to Master and Commander on an audiobook. And I had to like slow it down because it was so rich and so full of information and expression. Like, I'm not catching everything. I need to slow down on this. That's a kind of reading, to be able to attend to the word as it's coming to you orally. And so, I think those are the kind of things I would do. Singing together, memorizing poetry. And then that's very traditional too. When you think about the entire tradition of education, whether classical or Christian, memorizing the poets, memorizing the scriptures, especially the Psalms. I mean, that's kind of bread and butter of education for a lot of our tradition.
That's interesting that you would say the memorizing of poetry, because I just finished reading the Alice in Wonderland books to my youngest, who's 11. I had read it to him once when he was younger, but he didn't remember it at all. So we read it again by ourselves, and he was shocked at how young Alice was, because I think she's 7 in the second book or something. And the reason why he was shocked was because of how much poetry she has memorized. Now it gets all mixed up, in the book and everything. And that's supposed to be part of the joke. But he understood that she seemed to have this underlying wealth of poetry. And he was sort of shocked. He assumed that he's 11. He was assuming she was closer in age to him, but she has all this poetry, memorized, and she's like second grade. And I just thought that's interesting because it's a given in the book. It's not a big deal. It's not anything he finds the need to qualify. Just it's, she's that age. Of course, she has poetry memorized.
Right.
I don't really remember memorizing much poetry at all growing up. So it was just so interesting to me that it was just, of course, she's this way.
Right. Yeah. And that's we've seen this you've seen your own children, right? How the things that kind of captivate their attention, they imitate. Naturally in play. I was just watching my 5-year-old teach a school lesson to her doll.
Aww.
And, which is, it's touching in all kinds of ways, but she sounds like her teacher. These weeks I'm being on quarantine lockdown with virtual education, I've been hearing a lot more from my daughter's teacher. I'm like, oh, she sounds like Miss Gear. This is cool. And so she's imitating her. And as teachers, we can lean into that, right? We give them opportunities to do it more. So something like, memorizing a poem and reciting it. I used to teach a rhetoric class at the Geneva School when I was a rhetoric teacher there. And I would have the first lesson would be memorizing this line from a 20th century author. And it's, all speech that moves men was minted when some man's mind was poised and still. And I would, have the students just kind of say that over and over again with me for the whole class. All speech that moves men was minted when some man's mind was poised and still. And we might spend 15 minutes just on that, just saying it over and over again until everyone has it memorized just from me saying it orally. Then I would give them a sheet where it was printed out. And then I just ask them questions like, what do you notice? I don't want interpretation. I don't want you to tell me how it makes you feel or anything when you hear it. Just what do you notice? Kids invariably, he says a lot of right?
Yeah.
All right. And then there's places where it seems to be very rhythmic, but then it stops. And it gives me a chance to name some of the different, literary devices they're using there. But, it's also the lesson, here's how you become a rhetorician. Here's the art of rhetoric. We attended to the language. We listened to the effects of the language. We named it. And now we're going to try to imitate it. And then we would use that in our writing. We would change words. We would see what would happen if we, instead of the word minted, we had coined. Even when I say coined, everyone jumps back in their seats oh, that sounds so harsh after minted. And it has a different effect, right? Guess what? That's how language works. The effect of language, word choice. And so, I could give them a lesson on diction and syntax and say, yeah, word choice and the types of sentences you use is appropriate to different situations. But you start with memory and imitation. They're already attuned to that. And then I can tell them, listen, he made choices when he authored that phrase. And the choices were meaningful and they're effective for what he wanted to convey. That's what we're going to try to learn the art of in this class. It's kind of the big picture, first class. But I think that the same thing, again, that's what we're talking about with cultivating memory through imitative practice. And it starts with just mere imitation. I think too, I'm just talking, I'm blabbing. I'm so sorry.
Oh, this is great.
We
love it. It's fine.
Well, thank you for affirming me. I have a friend who says, "Yep, I'm totally an enabler. Just keep going." But Ben Frank, I loved it. Ben Franklin's autobiography, he gives one of the clearest passages on this ever, I think, where he talks about how he became as he said, having reasonable facility with the language. And he describes how he would read an article from The Spectator. I don't think this is in the book either. This is something else that was swirling in my mind as I wrote.
So we're getting a glimpse at volume 3 or edition 3.
This is the handbook, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So he's reading something in The Spectator, and he's like, that was a great article. I want to be able to do that. And so he would kind of read it over and over and over again until he could outline it. And then he would write the article back from memory. And then he would, reduce it to an outline again. And then he would, put them on different pieces of paper, and he would just set different parts of it out. And he would try to rewrite it in different order and everything. And so there's this idea being delighted by something, trying to imitate it. Then he would substitute words, different parts of speech for what was well said. And he said until sometimes he would rewrite an article and it would be better than the one that he had read to begin with.
That's awesome.
Oh, yeah. We joke around at school it's funny. It's PG-13 in some spots, but from a founding father. Or at least I'll say that to students. I'm but I'm not going to tell you where. And I have to go read it myself now. And my evil machinations have worked there.
I've got to ask you, because you talked about your daughter sounding like her teacher and she's teaching her dolls. Are things like free time and imitative play, are those both important parts? I mean, I know a school doesn't so much provide those as stay out of the way by, not assigning too much homework or whatever. But I mean, are those important for grammar?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think the idea of play is so important. And I mean, I think it's a distinct advantage of home education where some of the ways that school, I think you put it, I have to admit, Brandy, I shared one of your articles on Facebook last week. The one on, welcome to homeschooling.
Oh,
yeah. I put it on our Facebook page, like saying, if you're at home and you're, freaking out because you're not homeschooling your kids, feel overwhelmed. My friend, I call her my friend Brandy, wrote this over at her Afterthoughts blog. So hopefully you saw a huge spike from our
So that was you.
I mean, it could have been in the tens of people. But I think you called it the difference between homeschooling and school schooling. I laughed out loud when I read that. That's great. Yeah. So that distinct advantage you have of being able to, some people use it well, of like you own the time, or you get to decide the time in a way that the school has like a built-in bureaucracy to it where, sometimes the best you can do is stay out of the way. It came up in my bio that we're founding a new network of schools here in Florida. Mm-hmm. And we're opening our first campus in the fall. And we built into the day time in the garden and recess and skole in the day every day. But it's hard because you have to make decisions about what good things you're not going to be doing in order to do this more valuable thing of skole in the day. But yeah, I think play is important for I go off on a whole philosophy of play here, but I think things happen in play. Something else I used to do with my students in a philosophy class I taught, we would, it was a game that kids loved at school called Silent Speedball. I don't know if that, where, it seems like the consummate like substitute teacher game, like they don't know what to do and so, basically the students, so they all sit around in a circle, and it's basically you can throw the ball fast at each other across the room, and if you drop it, you're out. Or if you make a sound, you're out. And the kids get it's like Foursquare too. They get really into these games where they're like not in control of their own actions, except insofar as they're part of the game. And, I've used that, to like the logic of a conversation, that what we're trying to do here is everybody has to be serious and playing along. And we have to get to where like the conversation brings us into play, so to speak, and so anybody who's ever like we can say seriously played a game. That's kind of funny, right? Seriously playing. That means they get into it. And that's how a good book works. That's how a great conversation works. That's how, a scientific observation works. A person work on a math form, they know how to get into it. And I think sometimes the kind of poetic knowledge of how to get into something happens in play in a way that doesn't happen like anywhere else. And as teachers, we can use that, I think, to help students imagine what it's like to have fun learning, right?
Yeah.
To get into a conversation or to a book or something like that.
So you're saying you're building skole into the day for students at the school.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little glimpse of what that looks like? I'm dying to know, because we do have, we have moms. Our focus has often been like, we want to give these things to moms. And so we have moms ask, well, how do I give it to my children? And I do feel at a loss sometimes because I know my children, but I don't know exactly how I would do this for just like children in a more general sense.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's a lot there too, right? So your children, your family culture, and how those things kind of all work together, and you don't know how that is in everybody else's family. The same thing in school. School has a culture and atmosphere. Right. And so you have to have an atmosphere where that kind of like loving gaze that you can have during skole makes sense. We try to do, I say we try as if I have students right now. We are literally enrolling students and taking applications now to open in the fall. But, I don't know if Josef Pieper's book.
Leisure?
It's not leisure, but yeah, it develops some ideas from leisure. It's like a theory of festivity.
Yes.
In tune with the world.
Yeah, in tune with the world. Yeah, so two things that we're doing at the school, having the garden be the center. We call it Paleo STEM, the center of our science class. Because the garden is something that, unless you're like doing industrial farming or something like that, you have to pay attention to the seasons, right? So it puts you in tune with the seasons of nature and the rhythms of nature. We start every day in the chapel, just kind of following the order for prayer. And so this idea, like trying to root people into the rhythms of prayer and the rhythms of the garden as part of everyday life, to think that Josef Pieper has convinced me that those are kind of like essential aspects of being able to, having some in the festivity that's bound up with them. There's an inherent festivity with a harvest, kind of following the basic contours of like the church year or something, has festivity built into it. You're going to do some preparations for Christmas and you're going to celebrate, right. And some skole is going to happen because of the celebration. And if I read him right, like the ancient world had the reason that Aristotle was able to have his scholae is because they had slavery, right? They had like all of these people doing the manual labor, so there could be people who didn't have to do manual labor. The Christian appropriation of that world did two important things. I think it both said, no, actually working with your hands is not bad. God made Adam and Eve. And so, Aristotle's idea of like, you can't both work and have leisure. But it wasn't just enough to say that some work can be good. I mean, toil, toil and in human labors is bad, but there can be good work. But then also the idea of Lord's Day and the holidays in the Christian year provided these spaces where work has to be disbanded, and people, their work is purposeful. It's leading up to something. There's rest, there's feast, and then there's getting back to it. And so we want to like knit that in or weave that into the culture of the school through the garden and the chapel. That's one of the ways. Other ways, really doing some of the Charlotte Mason practices like art study, nature study. I love the way she teaches handicrafts while you do oral reading to kids. I think those are naturally like restful, but they're not purposeless activity. It's restful but purposeful activity that allows students to kind of cultivate that ability to attend while also doing something like a handicraft. So we're gonna incorporate those into our day as well.
That's so neat. I think that gives ideas for even people who aren't in the school. Well, not that anyone gets to go to school now, but hypothetically, when they get to go to school again.
Right. Yeah.
That's fascinating to me. I feel like one of the best things we ever did for our children, we have a on the large side, in terms of our neighborhood, at least property. We gave everybody their own little plot of land. And my 11-year-old has sort of like hijacked other plots of land. So he's building some sort of kingdom out there, but letting them all have a space that they could cultivate in any way that they wanted. And then seeing, like I've got one growing flowers and one growing vegetables, and one is only growing plants that her rabbits can eat.
Yeah.
Giving them the freedom of land, and really, other than providing some tools and seeds, we don't interfere at all. It's just been interesting to watch them all kind of come into themselves in a way and build their own unique relationship with the soil and with what they're doing. And I don't know, it's been fascinating to watch. I always liked the idea of the outside and gardening more than I actually liked doing it for real.
Yeah.
But I've always wondered if maybe some of that was just because I never experienced it as a magical freedom, really. And so I feel like that's what we gave our kids. I don't know. It's just been interesting to watch. So I can see how that would be beneficial to a school. We actually have a charter school here. And one of the big things that they do that parents just die to get their kids into the school is because they have a whole edible garden. Yeah. The charter school is funded by a really big farming company. And so their whole thing is they want to increase the interest in agriculture. And so their angle is like, so you get kids in the garden, you get them growing things. And I mean, these kids have a blast, and they get to eat the food in class. So exciting. So anyway, I think it's neat that you're incorporating the garden that way. So is it physically the garden is the center of your school?
No, the center of the school is actually this courtyard with a fountain area that's even where drop off is in the morning. So it's really neat how it's set up, but it's not.
Sounds pretty.
Yeah, it is. It's really pretty, and it's so great when you do this back before social distancing allowed to have parent preview events on the campus. We would always start I'd welcome people out there instead of having them come in the building. Like, this is where I'm going to welcome your children every day to school to this fountain. There's a "Let the Little Children Come Unto Me" statue of Jesus in the courtyard. that too, I said, the idea for the school was birthed here. As I looked there and I thought, children need to be welcomed to this place. This is a beautiful place. And that's the kind of the beginning then of Scholae, I think. You're taking them to a beautiful place that's only there really for the enjoyment of the beauty of it. The purpose is not just its utility to the place you're welcoming them in. You come in prayer, and again, you're not just saying prayers or hearing scriptures in order to get something done or get a grade, right? And so It's like engaging them in the same way that gardening. It's this purposeful activity, and I even love that you said your daughter growing it to feed her rabbit. So it's like it's even like personal. It's purposeful activity with an end to like make something else flourish and live. Like, that's awesome. I think that those finding ways to incorporate those into the day is so important. Also, Pieper's book, Only the Lover Sings, there's an essay in the beginning of that one called Work, Spare Time, and Leisure, which I think is so important. I think people hear leisure, again, one of these words that's transformed meaning. It means, time off work. So we define leisure in terms of time off because, what you're really supposed to be doing is, sitting in your cubicle and kind of like, moving papers in piles. And then when your time off, you get to go do non-purposeful activity like, watching movies or whatever. Instead of thinking, no, if your work is purposeful, then your time that you're not work could also be purposeful but restful. Anyway, I'd recommend that to any of your followers here who haven't read Pieper. I think Work, Spare Time, and Leisure is it's a work of grammar, I think. He's defining leisure for us.
So, and that's in Only the Lover Sings?
Yeah, I think it might be the first chapter in Only the Lover Sings.
It's funny. Ravi recommended that exact book to us. Actually, I think he's been on the show twice, and I think each time he's been on, he told us to buy that book. So now I'm hearing it from you. I need to do it. I need to obey.
Okay, you better do it, Brandy. I already own it.
You already own it? So you're not going to race me this time?
You can have the used copy on Amazon.
Hey, while you're at it, just get anything else that he's written.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. Well, that's why I have it. I went through a collection spurt. I'm like, wait a sec, he wrote other books. I have to buy them.
Yeah. You never, overestimate just like how dense some of the stuff is. Like if you've kind of been in the classical world and the Schole world, you're kind of like ready to read Pieper. But then I've recommended him to some people that go like, what is this guy talking about?
Well, part of that, I feel like In Tune with the World, the translation, I think, was a lot more readable. It was a different translator. Leisure, I wish it could be translated by someone different. I think that's part of it.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm looking at my bookshelf right now and I see Only the Lover Sings. Right next to it is Vegan Garoyan's book, Tending the Heart of Virtue. Are you all familiar with that book?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There you go. That's another guide I would give to any new grammar school teacher.
Yeah.
Read this, learn it, mark it, and inwardly digest it and get to work.
Well, and those sort of principles within the homeschool, I think it looks like morning time. Pam's not here to do the song and dance for morning time, but this is, that's when we sing and pray, and it's how we start our day and all those things. It sets the tone for the day, and it doesn't feel like the work, but it is the important part of our school day.
Oh yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly it. You're providing the frames. Like sometimes the most important first impression is most important. That first few minutes of a lesson kind of determines the success of the lesson. And that, morning time, I think is perfect. A perfect illustration of this kind of like, it's piety, gymnastic, music usually all together as well.
Mm-hmm. True. Is there any parting thoughts you'd like to leave us with on grammar before we go?
Oh boy, I feel like, haven't I told you like everything that I thought already? I feel so, I've just been kind of running on and on here.
It's been great.
Grammar, the one thing is I do still believe that the long term, we're going to have to learn some Latin and Greek again. I still believe that one. I know that's now it's in the appendix. I do, and this is a place where I know people disagree, and this could be another one of these controversial questions. It's kind of that Robert Frost quotation that says, poetry is that thing that's lost in translation. And, the reason I love Dorothy Sayers' Dante so much is she gives us a version, not just a translation. So she tries to recreate in English something. And so it connects to my experience of the English language. And, you can hear echoes of the prayer book and the Bible and Milton and Shakespeare in her translation in a way that I can only imagine Dante delivered in Italian and Virgil delivered in Latin and Homer delivered in Greek. I do think it's like a long-term thing. I think John Senior's right when he said it isn't just that we've forgotten to read some great books and we need to add the great books back to our curriculum. We've kind of have forgotten how to read. And so we have to start back with the stories and the poems. And like we all need a musical education. Yeah. But still thinking that long-term trajectory is, toward these great works and even reading them, the way that somebody like C.S. Lewis or Dorothy Sayers would be able to read them just like they were their own language.
We were actually talking about the need to have you on to talk about that. So you may get another email from us in the future.
Well, there we go. And I'll answer that email.
Good idea. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a delight to talk to you.
Oh, yes. Same here. Thank you for the opportunity. I've had a great time.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. At Schools Sisters, we want to be people who apply what we learn rather than just listening and forgetting. Schools Sheets are individual journal pages to help you apply the ideas you've taken in. Download your Schools Sheet for free from our show notes at schoolsisters.com/ss72. Have you upgraded your sistership membership to Sophie level yet? We highly recommend you do. Spring training is included for no extra charge. Plus, you get access to all the other great things, including the cutting room floor from this episode. We actually chatted with Kevin for over 90 minutes. I had to cut a lot, and it wasn't just his dog barking. As a Sophie member, you can listen to the cutting room floor selections while you wait for the next session of spring training. So go to schoolsisters.com/sistership to find out more about becoming a Sophie. Next episode is the last episode of the season. So sad, I know. Misty, Pam, Abby, and I will be talking about School A and how it changes with the seasons of motherhood. It's a conversation you will not want to miss. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone. So open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Okay, I'm on the way now. Yes.
There you are.
Right in time for my dog to start barking. I forget, I'm just used to speaking with human beings in person and not being recorded online. So, sometimes I just say exactly what I'm thinking at the time without a filter and go oh my goodness, that was put on Zoom.
We've been at this for a while. I should probably wrap us up.
Edit it down to 20 minutes of genius. That's all you
There you go.